The cold moonlight streaming through the single dusty window was the only thing that woke him. A shadow had fallen across his bed, a human shape that hadn't been there when he'd fallen into an exhausted sleep. His hand instinctively went for the pistol at his side, but it froze when she saw her. The Apache girl he'd found half dead in the canyon now stood over him, her borrowed nightdress soaked from a fresh journey in the rain, clinging to his skin like a second thought. She looked not like a woman he'd saved, but like a predator. Her hand was on his bare chest before he could move, her touch not gentle, but possessive. "I know why you hide in these mountains, cowboy," she said, her voice barely a whisper, but sharp enough to cut. "And now, your life is the price for my own." Caleb didn't breathe. The air in the cramped, lonely cabin turned thick and heavy, charged with the ozone of a storm that had already broken. The woman, the girl, didn't move. Her hand remained on his chest, a small thing, yet it felt heavier than a boulder, pinning him not with strength, but with a finality that rooted him to the thin mattress of his bedroll. He could feel the heat of her palm seeping through his skin, a stark contrast to the chilling pronouncement she had just delivered. He was a man well acquainted with threats. He had lived the life defined by them, by the cold companionship of a coat peacemaker and the constant whisper of a past that bayed at his heels like a hound from hell. But this was different. This wasn't the brash challenge of a drunken cowboy in a saloon, nor the calculated menace of a lawman with a warrant. This was something ancient, a reckoning delivered by a woman whose eyes held the vast, unforgiving emptiness of the very canyons he'd chosen for his exile. He had spent 6 years ensuring his life belonged only to him, a solitary existence, bought with regret and paid for in loneliness. To hear it was now forfeit, a piece of property to be collected, was a violation so profound it left no room for anger, only a silent, so deep stillness. She had been a specter of death when he found her. Now she was an avatar of fate, and the moonlight on her rain-slicked face was the cold, clinical light of judgment. The weight of his past failures settled on him, a familiar shroud. A man doesn't get to outrun his ghost forever. Sooner or later, they send someone to collect. His mind, against his will, flashed back to the day before. The sun was a merciless hammer in a brassy sky, beating down on the wind-scoured rock of the Dragoon Mountains. It was a place of splendid desolation, a landscape of raw red earth and skeletal ocotillo that had promised him nothing but solitude, and it had faithfully kept its word. For 6 years, this land had been his penance. He worked his trap lines with a methodical patience. The familiar scent of pine and creosote was a constant reminder of the life he had left behind, the life he had burned to the ground. He had learned the wisdom of the desert, that which is loud and boasts of its strength is often the first to perish. True survival was a quiet affair, a matter of watching, of listening, of understanding that you were a guest in a kingdom that did not care if you lived or died. He was mending a broken snare, the worn leather cool in his hands, when a flicker of wrongness caught his eye. Not the movement of a coyote, nor the shadow of an eagle. It was the unnatural white of tattered cloth, a blasphemy against the rust-red canvas of the canyon wall. He found her at the mouth of a shallow cave, a place the Chiricahua called the Breath of Spirits. She was tied to a makeshift bier of mesquite branches, left not as a prisoner, but as an offering.
Her simple buckskin dress was torn, her body limp and bruised. A small, intricately carved wooden bird lay on her chest, a symbol he didn't understand but recognized as sacred. His first thought was a cold, hard piece of survivalist wisdom, a lesson paid for in blood and betrayal. Walk away. This is not your fight. This is tribal business, and a white man's interference is a death sentence. The world was full of sorrows, and a man who tried to carry them all was a fool destined for an early grave. He had already made his choice back then, the choice of a coward. He had already walked away once.
But as he looked at the girl, at the quiet dignity of her unconscious face, another, older piece of wisdom surfaced. It was his father's voice, a memory from a life before the running. Son, there are things a man runs from, and there are things a man stands for. You don't get to choose when they come, only which man you'll be when they do. For 6 years he had been the man who runs. The emptiness of it, the hollow victory of his own survival, suddenly felt like its own kind of death. He looked at the girl, left for the sun and the vultures, and saw not an Apache, not a stranger, but a reflection of his own abandoned soul. To save her wouldn't fix his past, it wouldn't bring back the dead, but it would be one damn thing, one solitary act in a wasteland of regret that wasn't for him. It would be a second chance, not to live, but to be worthy of the life he still had. His knife, honed for skinning hides, felt strangely righteous in his hand as he sawed through the rawhide bonds. The rope beat into his shoulders as he lifted her, a fragile weight of broken bones and fading breath, and began the long, slow journey back to his cabin, one defiant step at a time. He was choosing to be the man who stands, knowing full well it would likely be the last choice he ever made. He had spent the night in a battle against a fever that threatened to claim what little life she had left. He'd cleaned her wounds, marveling at the strange, delicate blue markings tattooed in a subtle constellation on her collarbone, markings that felt older than the mountains themselves. He'd stripped away the ruined buckskin, his touch careful and impersonal, and slipped one of his own clean, oversized night dresses over her small frame. Her vulnerability was a physical ache in his chest, a stark reminder of a gentler life he'd once known, a life filled with the scent of lavender and the soft rustle of cotton. As she lay unconscious in his bedroll, he had sat in the single rickety chair he owned, watching the rise and fall of her chest, a silent vigil against the darkness. And in that quiet, desperate space, he had talked. The words, rusted from years of disuse, came out in a ragged whisper, confessions offered to an unhearing God. He spoke of Elara, of a promise he had broken. He spoke of a sheriff, a good man he had betrayed. He spoke of the guilt that was a constant physical weight on his soul. "I ain't a good man," he'd murmured into the firelit gloom, the words a bitter taste in his mouth. "I don't deserve no second chance. But you don't deserve to die for a law you never made." Sometime before dawn, her eyes had fluttered open. For a single, startling moment they were clear, lucid pools of ancient obsidian. They'd found his across the small cabin, and he saw no fear, no confusion. He saw only a strange, solemn recognition, as if she knew him, as if she had been expecting him. Then, as quickly as it came, the understanding was gone, her eyelids sinking shut as the fever pulled her back under. The moment had unsettled him more than finding her. It was the feeling of being known, of being seen in a place he'd designed for perfect, impenetrable solitude. Now, back in the present, with her hand pressing against his heart and the cold moonlight painting her a merciless silver, he understood.
The choice he thought he was making for her, he was actually making for himself. And the price was steeper than he could have ever imagined.
"The law of the sky-painted people is subtle," she said, her voice stronger now, no longer a whisper but a statement of undeniable truth. Her gaze didn't waver. He who saves a life dedicated to the spirits must offer his own in its place. You disturbed a sacrifice, Nanhan. You chose to pull me from the sacred path. Now the choice is mine to make. Caleb stared into her eyes, the last of his fight draining out of him. The title she used, Nantan, captain, was a cruel, knowing jab at the past he'd tried to bury. He saw no malice in her face, no thirst for vengeance. He saw only a judge, a woman bound by a tradition as old and as unforgiving as the stone around them. And in her gaze, he saw his own helpless surrender, not to a woman, but to a fate he had sealed the moment his blade had touched that rawhide rope.
The silence that followed her declaration was a living thing. It settled in the cramped space of the cabin, absorbing the moonlight, smothering the sound of Caleb's own heartbeat. He had expected a threat of violence, a demand for blood vengeance. He had not expected the chilling logic of a spiritual transaction, a balancing of cosmic scales that he had unknowingly tipped. Her use of his old rank, Nantan, was a surgical strike, laying bare the man he once was, the leader who had failed his people and fled into self-imposed exile. For 6 years, the mountains had been his monastery, his penance. He was Caleb, the trapper, a ghost who left no tracks. To be called captain again was to be reminded of the life, the honor, and the woman he had buried under a mountain of guilt. That this Apache girl, a stranger he had pulled from the brink of death, could know that name. It was a violation that stripped him bare. It meant his sanctuary was, and always had been, a cage of his own making, its walls transparent to the very past he thought he'd blinded. The debt wasn't just for saving her life. It was for all the lives he had failed to save. This wasn't a choice. It was a bill, long overdue, delivered by the most unlikely of collectors. A flicker of his old defiance, the stubborn pride of a man who had refused to break, sparked within him. "I owe no life to anyone," he said, his voice a low rasp, thick with disuse and a sudden sharp anger. "I saved you from being buzzard meat. That's a gift, not a debt. You can walk out that door and go back to your people, or you can stay till the fever's broke. But my life is my own." It was a fool's bluff, and he knew it. A man who owns nothing can't be threatened with loss, and for the first time in years, Caleb felt the terror of having something to lose again, his precious, empty freedom. Her expression didn't change. It remained one of serene, solemn authority, the face of a priestess, not a prisoner. "Your life was never your own, Caleb Malone," and the use of his full, forgotten name was like a fist to the gut. "It belongs to the memory of Ilara. It belongs to the loyalty of Sheriff Thompson, who you left to face the consequences in a town called Redemption. It belongs to the ghosts you fled. I am merely the one who has come to claim it on their behalf." The air left his lungs. Every word was a perfectly placed shot, striking targets he believed were buried too deep for any living soul to find. This wasn't a guess. It was an indictment. He was no longer a ghost. He was a man known, a man weighed and measured. A profound weariness, deeper than any physical exhaustion, settled into his bones. His father's wisdom echoed in his mind, a sad and simple truth he had tried so hard to unlearn. A man's choices are like stones dropped in a still pond, son. The ripples travel farther than you know, and they always come back to the shore where you're standing. His ripples, it seemed, had finally returned. He saw then that the choice she offered wasn't a punishment. In its own harsh, unforgiving way, it was a form of grace. Death or a life with purpose, even if that purpose was servitude. It was, in its own way, a second chance. The question was, what kind of man had he become? Was he strong enough to pay the price? Before he could answer, a new sound cut through the night, the crunch of heavy boots on loose gravel outside, followed by a low, drunken chuckle. Both Caleb and the Apache girl, Shima, as she would later tell him her name was, froze. Their private spiritual reckoning was over. The brutal, profane reality of the frontier had just kicked down the door. "Well, now, look what we got here," a gravelly voice slurred from the doorway. 3 men stood silhouetted against the moonlit landscape, their shapes large and menacing. They were prospectors by the looks of them, men whose souls had been scoured out by greed, leaving only a raw animal hunger in their eyes. Their leader, a big man with a greasy beard and a shirt stained dark with sweat and filth, took a step inside, his gaze falling on Shima. "Hiding a little treasure up here in the mountains, are ya, trapper?" Caleb was on his feet in an instant, moving between them and her, his body a shield born of pure instinct. The pistol felt solid and real in his hand, a familiar comfort in a world that had just been turned upside down. "This is my claim," he said, his voice flat and cold. "Turn around and walk away." The leader's eyes crawled over Shima, lingering on the way the damp nightdress clung to her form. "She a woman?" he sneered, a predatory glint in his eye.
Caleb's mind raced. He was 1 man against 3. A fight was a losing proposition. But to deny her in that moment would be to abandon her twice. It would be a surrender to the basest instincts of this world, the very thing he had just been judged for. He saw her not as his judge, not as his owner, but as a life he was now responsible for. He had touched the sacred path, and this was the consequence. The essential protector fantasy he mocked in others was now his only strategic move. This wasn't about feeling. It was about survival. He looked at the prospector, his gaze as hard and unyielding as the mountains themselves. "She is," he said, the words tasting strange in his mouth, "and you're on our land. Now get." The bearded man held his hands up in mock surrender, a cruel smirk twisting his lips. "Easy now, friend. Just being neighborly. A man get lonely up in these hills. It's a hard country. Makes you wonder about the past, don't it? The things a man has got to do to get by." He let the words hang in the air, a veiled threat and a casual observation, the kind of talk that meant he knew more than he was letting on. Caleb felt a cold knot tighten in his gut. The past wasn't just in the cabin with him. It was outside, too, sniffing at his door. These weren't just random drifters. They were looking for something, or someone. The leader's eyes flickered between Caleb and Shima, a shrewd calculation happening behind the drunken haze. Caleb could see the man weighing the odds, measuring the risk against the potential reward. Shima, behind Caleb, was perfectly still. She wasn't cowering. She was observing, her silence more unnerving than any threat. Then she spoke, her voice quiet but clear, meant only for Caleb's ears. "His left hand is slow. He carries his weight on his right foot. He will draw across his body. A fool's move." Caleb's blood ran cold. The tactical assessment was flawless, the observation of a seasoned warrior. Who was this woman? He felt a flicker of the captain he used to be, the man who lived and died by such details. He was fighting to save this woman, and in doing so, he was being forced to remember the skills that had cost him everything. It was a cruel, perfect trap. The prospector seemed to sense the shift in the room, the sudden hardening of Caleb's resolve. He spat a wad of tobacco on the cabin floor. "Have it your way, trapper. Plenty of unclaimed treasures in these mountains." He backed out slowly, his companions following, their laughter echoing unnaturally in the vast silence as they disappeared into the darkness. The immediate threat was gone, but a larger one now loomed. They knew something, or someone. The silence returned, but it was different now. It was filled with the residue of the threat, the shared danger that had forged a brittle, unwilling alliance between them. The moonlight fell on Shima, and for the first time, Caleb saw the faintest tremble in her hand as she pulled the nightdress tighter around her shoulders. In that small, involuntary movement, he saw not the implacable judge, but the girl who had been left to die on a mountain. She was both. The line between his savior and his charge, his owner and his ward, blurred and dissolved. He looked up the empty doorway, then back at her. The debt was real. The threat was real. His isolation was over. His life was the price. The only question now was whether it was a price for his past or a down payment on his future. He holstered his pistol, the click of the hammer echoing the finality of his decision. "Looks like you got your price after all," he said, his voice weary but clear. "My life for yours." He'd accepted the bargain not because of the spirit's law, but because of the only law that mattered now. Survival. He would be her protector. He would be her shield. And in doing so, maybe, just maybe, he could finally stand for something again.
The first rays of dawn painted the canyon walls in strokes of rose and gold, but the new day brought no warmth to the cold reality inside the cabin. An unspoken truce, fragile and temporary, held them in its grip. The confrontation with the prospectors had changed the very air they breathed. What had been a spiritual reckoning was now a tactical problem. The ghosts of Caleb's past were no longer ethereal whispers. They had names, faces, and a physical presence in the mountains. Shima, the woman who claimed his life as forfeit, was now the very person he had to keep alive. It was a perfect, brutal irony, a kind of karmic poetry that the frontier seemed to specialize in. She sat by the newly stoked fire, wrapped in one of his thick wool blankets, her gaze fixed on the flames as if divining some future from their dance. The wet nightdress was laid discarded, and she was back in the buckskin dress he had cleaned and mended, the familiar clothing a reclamation of her identity. He watched her from across the small room, cleaning his pistol with methodical, practiced motions, the familiar scent of gun oil, a small anchor in a sea of uncertainty. She hadn't just assessed the prospector's fighting stance, she had deconstructed it with the cool, analytical eye of a master strategist. The hidden women, she had called her people. They were not, it seemed, a tribe of helpless virgins. They were something else entirely. My people are not of this world, Nenten. We are keepers of the old ways, the balance. When a life is saved, a debt is created. It is not about punishment. It is about harmony. The life you saved, it was consecrated. Taking it back has created a void, a disharmony that the world will try to fill. And those men last night, Caleb asked, sliding a freshly oiled cylinder back into the cult. Were they a part of that harmony? She finally turned to look at him, and her eyes held a sorrow so deep it seemed to draw the light from the room. They are part of the disharmony, vultures drawn to a void. The man you knew as Sheriff Thompson made powerful enemies when he tried to protect the sacred lands. Men who believe everything has a price, that all things can be owned. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. When you fled redemption, you did not just abandon a man, Caleb. You abandoned a post. The wolves you were holding at bay, they came flooding in after you were gone. Those men are not prospectors. They are bounty hunters, looking for what they believe is the last key to the sacred lands. They are looking for me. The last piece of the puzzle clicked into place.
His personal failure, his act of cowardice 6 years ago was not a contained event. It had consequences, ripples that had spread and drowned the very things he had sworn to protect. Ilara's death wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of this one. He had run from his guilt, only to find it waiting for him here, embodied in a sacred woman hunted by the very men he had empowered through his absence. He was not her protector by choice or even by law. He was her protector by the ironclad logic of his own failure. It was a debt he could never fully repay, but it was a debt he could die trying to honor. His second chance had a face, a name, and a target on its back. This was not about redemption. This was about finally, belatedly doing his duty. He had to get her to safety, back to her people. Not just for her, but for the memory of the man he was supposed to have been. The wisdom of his father returned, not as a comfort, but as a command. You don't get to choose when they come, only which man you'll be when they do. A sharp crack of a rifle shot shattered the morning calm, splintering the wooden frame of the cabin's single window. "They're back," Caleb said, his voice grim. There was no surprise, only the weary certainty of a soldier who knew the battle was inevitable. He tossed Shima a spare pistol and a pouch of ammunition. "Stay low and keep your head down. I'm going to draw them out." He kicked open the cabin door and laid down a field of covering fire, the roar of the Colt a familiar thunder in the quiet canyon. He saw 3 of them, using the rocks and scraggly brush for cover, a 4th stand back, likely the marksman with the rifle. They weren't just bounty hunters, they were disciplined, moving with the cold efficiency of men who killed for a living. He was outmanned and outgunned, a ghost fighting a war he'd already lost once. But this time, he wasn't fighting for his own skin. He was fighting for the last, tattered shred of his honor. Inside the cabin, Shima did not cower. She moved with a fluid grace, a shadow against the firelit wall. She wasn't a warrior, not in the way of men who wielded fire and lead. Her strength was something quieter, more profound. As Caleb fought, a strange, low humming sound began to fill the small cabin. It was a chant, a series of rising and falling notes that seemed to vibrate in the very timbers of the structure. It was the language of the mountains, of the wind, of the unshakable spirit of her people. And as she chanted, Caleb felt something shift within him. The fear, the cold knot of dread that had been his constant companion for 6 years, began to dissolve. In its place, a strange, fierce calm settled over him. He was no longer fighting against the past. He was fighting for a future, even if it wasn't his own. The battle was brutal and swift. Caleb, moving with a desperate clarity, managed to take down 2 of the hunters, but the 3rd got the drop on him as he was reloading, the big bearded man from the night before tackling him to the ground. His breath was foul, his eyes alight with a mad, greedy fire. "She's worth a fortune, Trapper, enough to buy a whole new life." Before he could strike, a shadow fell over them both. Shima stood there, her face a mask of cold, serene fury. In her hand she held the sacred wooden bird from the byre, its edge now revealed to be as sharp as obsidian. Without hesitation she drew it across the bounty hunter's throat. It was not a savage act of violence, but a swift, clean, and merciful execution, an act of justice as old as the mountains. The remaining marksman, seeing his leader fall, scrambled away into the canyons, a coward's retreat. Silence descended once more. The air was thick with the scent of gunpowder and blood. Caleb lay on the ground, a deep gash in his side, the red earth drinking his life's blood. Shima knelt beside him, her hands pressing against the wound, her chant now a soft, heartbreaking lullaby of healing and sorrow. "You kept your promise, Nantan. You stood." He looked up at her, at this impossible woman who was both a spirit and a survivor, his judge and his salvation. The debt was paid, not the one her laws demanded, but the one his own soul had levered against himself. He had not run, he had stood, he had protected. In the end, he had been the man his father had raised him to be. It had taken him 6 years of lonely hell to find his way back, but here, at the end of it all, he had finally found a measure of peace. "My life for yours," he murmured, his voice faint, the words no longer a bargain, but a gift freely given. Her hand tightened on his, her touch a final anchoring grace. He felt the last of his strength leaving him, the edges of the world growing soft and dark. He closed his eyes, and for the first time in 6 years, he did not see the ghost of his past. He saw only the endless, blue-gray calm of a dawn sky, the quiet promise of a final, peaceful rest. The ripples had finally come to shore.